Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations on Racial Equality. I'm still in shock and awe that this is actually happening, and so many of you have registered and decided to show up. We're going to wait another couple of minutes before we officially kick off, so I'm just going to screen share with you again and put the holding slide back up. Please continue to introduce yourselves. As you know, the session is being recorded. I'm going to pull up my chat function here. Please introduce yourselves, where you're coming from, where you're calling from, whose country you're on. And as I mentioned a second ago, Sophie will be managing the chat for me, but it'll look like it's me typing. It's actually Sophie. So we'll try and moderate the questions as much as we can. And Sophie will give me a heads up on any pertinent questions. I'm calling in from Palawa country here on Lutruwita. I'll do a proper acknowledgement when we initially start our session. I just want to give you all a minute to settle in and say hello. I believe there's a type form survey that you would have got in your confirmation email or reminder email this afternoon. If you could please support us, help us by filling out that survey. It's 7 or 8 quick questions, and it's really, really helpful for all of us here at Kind Enterprises if you can give us just some basic information about why you came, what you're looking for, and that way we can customize the rest of the sessions to exactly what you need them to be, and we can just learn a bit about you as well. So hopefully that link is in your emails, but it's also going to be in the chat function any second now. There it is right now. I'll copy it and I can paste it back in again in a minute if I need to. So yeah, while we're waiting to begin, or anytime throughout this session, please do click on that link and fill out those quick questions for us. Danila from Nam, thank you for coming. Good to see you. Cheryl from Darwell country. So great to see so many of you coming here tonight. I know we had some issues with the registration. Some of you had to re-register. We've already got about 89 people signed in tonight. So it looks like it's going to be pretty busy tonight. I'll close the chat. I'll put up the holding slide for one more second. And in a minute or two, we will begin. All right. Good evening, everyone. It is now 7:36. We've got almost 100 of you on board already. Thank you for all of you who signed in on time or even earlier. My name's Erfan Daliri. It is my absolute pleasure to be hosting tonight's seminar. I'm in shock and awe as to how many people registered. We had over 250 registrations. As you know, we lost some of those emails thanks to a glitch with Zoom, but we've already got 100 of you back again today. And we look like that number is growing quite quickly, 95 participants already. And of course, the sessions are going to be recorded, and this will be an ongoing series of conversations. So if you miss one or two, you can catch one of the recordings. As I mentioned, I am calling you from the land of the Palawa here on Lutruwita, which is also referred to Tasmania. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of past, present, and future, and to acknowledge that wherever we are working, living, studying, we are doing so on the lands of the First Nations people of this continent. And it's important to be aware of that every day, not just during meetings and seminars and series and conferences, but in everyday life. It's important to remember that sovereignty has not been ceded, and that the First Nations people of this continent deserve acknowledgement of their rightful ownership of their custodianship of the lands, and some sovereignty, not just over themselves, self-sovereignty, but also sovereignty over the lands on which we live. Thanks for introducing yourselves and where you're calling in from today. Tonight is going to be a very brief kind of overview, introduction to the series. We will go into some content. We will touch on some complex themes. So it's really important for you to stay relaxed, make sure you're breathing, make sure you take a pause for a deep breath every now and then, Obviously, this is not a very easy conversation to have, which is why there's been so much interest in having this series of seminars so that we can actually break through some of those barriers and actually become more competent and confident when talking about race and racial equity. I'm going to go to the slides now, and I'll be coming backwards and forwards between the slides. So bear with me. As I just said, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the First Nations people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this continent, who are the rightful custodians of these lands. I myself am calling you from Lutruwita, the land of the Palawa, here in Tasmania. And this map of this great continent shows you just how many individual independent nations existed on this country. We like to celebrate how multicultural our society is, and the different parts of the world that our population come from. But I need to assure you all tonight that this continent was always a multicultural continent. Prior to colonization, for 80,000 years, this continent had 500 independent nations, each nation with multiple clans and tribe groups. Each nation had its own distinct language and culture. All up, there was 800 different languages and dialects on this continent, of people living in peace and prosperity for 80,000 plus years. So when we talk about multiculturalism and how wonderful it is to have a multicultural nation, I would like to remind us all that this place was always multicultural, and they had a sense of cohesion and peace about their society that we are now trying to regain somehow in 2022 post-colonization. And it's important to remember this context. When we want to have conversations about race and racial equity, it's important to always contextualize it. I have conversations with clients all over the world, and in every part of this world, the conversation around race is a different conversation. But here on this land, this is the context within which we are holding this conversation. Very briefly, you all know who I am and what we do at Kind Enterprises. We're a social change consulting firm. We offer training and consulting, etc. I'd love to connect with more of you who haven't heard about our work. If we haven't already worked with you, then please do feel to reach out. But this is us, Kind Enterprises, and there's myself, Sophie, and a whole wider team around us. These are some of the clients we work with. Some of you might be here tonight with us. Hi, if we've worked with you recently. Whether it's cross-cultural training, whether it's anti-racism strategy, whether it's systems thinking for social change, or anti-racism training. We work with clients all over the world, and we want to make sure that we make this conversation, this work around race equity, as accessible as possible. As I mentioned, we do these sorts of things, but that's not why we're here for tonight. You know what we do. What we are here really to do is this conversation on race equity. Why we did this is because, as I said, we work with clients every day of the week in these areas of trying to create unity and diversity and equity and inclusion. And we see this strong desire to want to do this work. And yet we also see a lot of challenges and barriers to the work. People often find that they are incapable or lacking confidence to actually engage in the conversations. And those who do have the confidence sometimes lack the competence. And those who have the confidence and the competence come across other challenges and barriers in the organization, whether it's resistance from colleagues, whether it's the structural and systemic challenges they have to overcome. So in order to scale our work and accelerate this process of creating positive social impact, we decided to launch this seminar series and to be able to give what we give our clients every day of the week to anyone who'd like to join freely: students, retirees, activists, academics. It's a welcome for everyone, whether you're a professional in the D&I space, whether you're holding a position in diversity and inclusion in your organization, or whether you're working for a local council. This is for everyone. So sometimes we might be talking about some things that might seem very basic to you. It's because I'm speaking to the entire audience. I'm speaking to everyone. Some people who may not have had a conversation about race in many, many years, and others amongst you, my colleagues, are quite competent in these spaces. So some of the things might seem basic to you, but I assure you, we'll push the boundaries as well and get to some complex stuff as well. To give you an overview, these are some of the things that we're going to cover in the next 12-part series. And I'm aware that not everyone's going to be there for all 12 sessions. But as I said, these recordings will be made available and you'll be able to watch them after the session. We're going to talk about disparity. We're going to talk about justice. We're going to talk about power and the role it plays in creating equity and inequity. We'll talk about a systems approach and what that means. We'll discuss the construct of race and what subtle racism is as opposed to overt racism. Touch on intersectionality, do a bit of a history every now and then. Every second session or so, we might do a bit of history, and basically help build out your repertoire of conversational skills and knowledge in this area. In tonight's introduction to race equity, I will break down some of the core themes so you can understand some of the basic concepts. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to systems thinking and why we need to apply a systems thinking approach when trying to create racial progress. We'll talk about navigating emotions. I mean, emotions is one of the biggest barriers to these conversations, not just expertise, but our own emotions and the emotions we come across when trying to have these conversations. If you feel like there's one of these boxes that you'd really like to hear about and you did it in today's session, I assure you it will come up in next week's session or the week after or the week after that. We'll try and get through as much as we can tonight in this session. For those who are raising hands, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to take questions at this point. So hopefully Sophie, who's managing the chat for me, can respond to any administrative or logistical questions. Some of the learning outcomes for tonight and throughout the series, we're going to talk about the construct of race, how race functions in society and at work, the dynamics that are at play. Hopefully you can build some confidence to engage in the conversations around race. I want to build your capacity to be able to see race and how it plays out, as well as to dismantle its impacts as well. And then also, obviously, as an outcome, develop your capacity to be able to create a cohesive society, a cohesive and inclusive workplace, a cohesive and equitable community. All of these things, as much as we like to already be there, we're not quite there. So building our capacity and our resilience and our competence to have these conversations is what's going to allow us to move closer towards the ideal we all know we want to be living in. As a bit of groundwork, some framework to give you an idea, this is one of the quotes that has influenced my life since childhood. As a Baha'i, it's these types of quotes that have informed my work and how I go about it. The earth is but one country, and mankind, its citizens, is the kind of education that I was raised in. And regardless of how triggering it might be sometimes to talk about race and colorism and the disparity against lines of color that we would like to do away with, it is really important to realize that at the core fundamental level, we are actually one. We are one family. We are one race. We are all those things. But this is not yet an actual reality. So I want to talk a little bit about this for a moment. We understand, and I accept as a person, that on a deeper spiritual, even on an ecological level, scientifically, biologically, we are connected, like the trees in the forest are connected. Socially, we're also connected. And there is no way in which we can exist or imagine ourselves existing as disparate communities. Yet, our current physical lived reality is not that. Someone's raising their hand. I can't answer questions right now. So if you just lower that, thank you. Our current physical lived reality is not the same as what our deeper spiritual ecological reality actually is. So as much as we believe in those sentiments of one race and one family, I'd like for all of you to consider, why is it that when we understand on a spiritual or scientific or ecological level that we are one, why is our current physical lived reality showing so much disparity? These are some of the ways in which we recognize and we see disparity in our lives. I'll give you a minute to have a look at this. And of course, you will have access to these slides once the sessions are over as well. So you don't need to note all these down or take screenshots, even though you are welcome to take a screenshot if you'd like. But everything from wealth gaps and health gaps to child mortality and child removal rates to incarceration rates and deaths in custody, through to lacking diversity in the workplace or racial profiling or prejudicial treatment in public to public vilification, there is disparity between how people are treated, whether it's subtle or extreme, whether it's threatening or causing emotional trauma. Disparity exists, and it's time for us to really tackle this and work towards a society that we know we want to be living in, but it just doesn't quite exist yet. This is another quote from the Baha'i writings, which is, has influenced my life greatly, and helps us really kind of conceptualize the planet in a way it's very aligned to systems thinking. It says, regard humanity as a single individual and one's own self as a member of that corporeal form, and to know of a certainty that if pain or injury afflicts any member of that body, it must inevitably result in suffering for all the rest. This is one of the ways that I think about my community on a local level, on a national level, and as a global society. If there is disparity or inequity or injustice or suffering in any part of that society, local or global, it will impact the whole eventually in one way, shape, or form, and it holds back the whole of that community. Now, some of you might be thinking this is a bit of a spiritual kind of esoteric kind of approach to race equity, but I wanted to show you that before I took a more systems thinking kind of approach to it, because that quote, even though it comes from a spiritual school, parallels what systems thinking is all about in today's modern scientific world. Those of you who are familiar with systems thinking will know that it is a shift from linear thinking to circular thinking. And its key principle in systems thinking is that all elements of a system are interconnected and interrelated. This means that the health of any individual sector or segment is interrelated with the health of the entire system. Now, if you think of that on a human body level, or on a local ecosystem level, on an organizational culture level, even on a car, you understand that different components that form a particular system all kind of need to be having some level of relative health or success in order for the whole system to function. And if any individual component of a body, if an organ or any component within a car is deficient or lacking in resources or not able to properly function or not able to properly contribute to that whole system, then the whole system will suffer from that. So as much as someone keeps raising their hand in the all hands. Thank you. So you can understand it in a systems thinking kind of way. You can understand it in an ecosystem kind of way. You can think of it in a clockwork kind of way. In any way you think about it, there are parallels, whether it's spiritual or scientific or social. Systems need to be able to have some relative success within each of the components in order for them to function. And that's why I love being able to find parallels between science and religion, is that they actually do sometimes say the same thing in different languages. So from a systems thinking perspective, social change actually requires a holistic approach. It means that social progress, whether we're talking economic development or educational outcome, whether it's environmental sustainability and addressing climate action, climate change, or global prosperity, they all require a systems approach. And this recognizes that the success of the whole is dependent on the success of the components that form that whole. Now, within a racial equity lens, if you can think about that in a race equity lens, that means that people from different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities need to be able to have have the same level of access and opportunity and influence on decision-making processes and positions in leadership, so that we can have a cohesive, united, and diverse society. If any individual group or sector of our community is not able to influence those situations, then we have imbalance, which eventually leads to inequity. So thinking about it in a race equity lens, a systems approach would ensure that we actually have better educational outcomes for all students and create an environment that is conducive to learning. With regards to business, if you apply a race equity lens, it means we could improve productivity and profit retention rates and innovation within the workplace. We could create more effective policy that actually serves the needs of the whole community, create better working conditions, create a more prosperous arts community in whatever context within your working. And I know you're all coming from different spaces, different sectors. in every space you're in, applying a racial equity lens will allow us to be able to create a more cohesive, harmonious, and prosperous space. And outcomes will be improved for everybody within that system. So, having given you a brief 10-minute rundown on systems thinking and a systems approach to social change, let's get to the main part of tonight's conversation about race. So one of the reasons why we had so much interest in tonight's session was because we framed it around improving confidence and skills to talk about race, because that's one of the biggest challenges we face in society, is our own emotions and nerves when it comes to even talking about race in a public setting. So I want us to take a deep breath right now, relax back into our seats, and to consider whenever a conversation about race comes up, or we need to have a conversation about race, or even thinking about having a conversation about race, different emotions come up for us. And I'm going to stop the screen share right now so I can actually look at the chat a little bit and follow what's going on. And what I'd like to ask you to do is to type away in the chat, what are some of the emotions that potentially come up for us when we attempt to have a conversation about race? Thank you. Just type away. I'm looking at these very quickly. Look at that. Sadness, shame, anger, guilt, frustration, self-consciousness. Absolutely. Trepidation even. We could feel fear. Look at that. Usually it takes me 5 or 10 minutes to get half a dozen feelings out of people. But tonight, obviously, we've got a bigger group. Vulnerability. Self-consciousness comes up again. Nervousness comes up again. Excitement to share my background, great. Some people feel lost and confused. There's confusion again there. You can see how broad and why. Keep going. I'm going to keep talking, but while you keep typing away, you can see how broad the various emotions are that come up for us the minute we want to talk about race. All right. Some people feel embarrassed for the person addressing them. Some people feel angry. Some people feel hopeless, inadequate, intimidated. It's such a broad spectrum. And this is really one of the key reasons why we aren't able to have successful conversations about race, is because not only have we not had the proper academic kind of introduction to that, we haven't really thought about these concepts very much, and we haven't been taught about these concepts much. But then on top of that, there's all of these emotions that come with it as well. Regardless of our experience of race, regardless of what side of the equation we're on, whether we've witnessed it, experienced it, benefited from it, suffered from it, the spectrum of emotions that possibly come up for us is immense. And it's important for us to acknowledge this, not just tonight, but in every time we attempt to have a conversation about race. I want you to think about this exercise that we just did now. So many different emotions come up for us and the other person who's also on the other side of the conversation. I want to show you a slide now that shows you a few of the emotions that people have said have come up for them. And you've said most of these already in the chat. Irritation, intimidation, inspiration, disappointment, discomfort, defensiveness, hope, anxiety, depression, shock, sadness. So many emotions come up for us. And the reason why I wanted to go through this exercise is not to just remind you of the difficult emotions that come up, but there's an exercise I'd like for you to remember for tonight and for every other time you have a conversation, whether it's in a professional setting or in a personal setting. I'd like you to do this. When in the middle of a conversation or a discussion or even a seminar about race, and you feel an emotion coming up for you, I want you to try and name it in the moment, whatever it happens to be. If it's defensiveness, write that down. Just note it down. If it's shame, note that down. If it's frustration or self-consciousness, write that down. And unfortunately, you're right. It's Jules Smith. She's saying not enough of the emotions are positive. Absolutely. Unfortunately, most of the emotions that come up are negative. And that tells us a lot as well. Now, what you do with this exercise is not only do you write it down, but also try to note when it came up for you. If it's a particular slide or a fact of information about race that bothered you, if it's a particular word or a particular slide, write that down as well. Because just naming the emotion that comes up for you and then writing down when it came up for you You can then unpack that later. You can think about and reflect on that after the conversation is over or after the seminar is over. And you can consider, why was I feeling that emotion? And what does this tell me about me? This emotional management tool here, this little exercise that I've just shared with you, is a great way to be able to A, acknowledge the broad range of emotions that come up for us, and B, take responsibility for them and actually learn from the emotions. Because why we feel certain things can actually tell us a lot about where we are at as individuals. And that's for your emotional safety and for my emotional safety, especially in live sessions. Tonight, unfortunately, I can't hear you because we're in a webinar format, but for everyone's emotional safety, it's important to be able to give people these tools to stretch their emotional literacy and understand where they're coming from. If we could think about some of the main reasons. Now, we've thought about some of the emotions, but if you could categorize some of these emotions, what would be some of the main reasons why it's difficult to talk about race? Again, feel free to type into the chat function so that I can see what's coming up in the chat. Why is it so difficult to talk about race? If we were to try to categorize some of those emotions we just shared a moment ago. Sophia, thank you. Trauma, fear of offending. You do not want to offend someone. People becoming defensive. Very good. Exactly. These exactly are the things I'm talking about. Not knowing enough. I don't always have the energy to deal with it. Absolutely. Feeling inferior. Feeling targeted. Compassion fatigue. Lack of knowledge. There you go. I'm going to show you what I've put up on these. And a lot of these are already in this slide as well. You can keep going because others will be reading your comments in the chat as well. This is what I had. If I thought about this for a while, and I compartmentalize some of those emotions and try and find out some core issues there. And what I found was that there was a significant number of emotions that we could put into one category, uncomfortable emotions. We don't want to really feel these types of emotions. And shame is quite high on that list of emotions that we don't want to feel, right? So trying to avoid difficult emotions is one reason. Fear of getting it wrong, a number of you have shared that, and it's absolutely true. Not knowing what to say, how to say it, which words to use, what word is offensive, what word's not offensive. That fear, that trepidation that some of you talked about is absolutely there. But then also there's fear of retaliation and retribution for having spoken about race. And I know a number of you who have registered already today, because I know some of you personally have also experienced this. It's very well known that raising issues of race doesn't benefit you. Just like raising issues of sexism in the workplace doesn't generally benefit anybody, right? So fear of retaliation and retribution can sometimes be one of the reasons why most people don't talk about race, because sometimes when we do, we get put on unpaid leave. We risk our relationships with managers and colleagues. We risk damaging or losing relationships and friendships with our neighbors and friends and family. And this is a very significant reason why often conversations around race are avoided and issues around race are not spoken about. Past trauma, a number of you mentioned that in the chat as well, or not wanting to re-trigger that. And then there's resistance, organizational resistance, people's resistance. We can't be, someone mentioned that just don't have the energy to deal with it sometimes. And we don't want to face that resistance and be face to face with it. So again, we avoid it, ignore it, and allow it to persist because sometimes the immediate reaction is too strong for us. Knowing this is actually a big part of becoming better advocates for change. Being aware of what we've just gone through in the last 10 minutes, which is the potential emotions that can come up for us, and then being aware of why it is difficult for us and for other people to talk about race. For some of us, it's fear of getting it wrong and saying something that's offensive. For someone else, it's fear of retaliation from your colleagues, from your management, from your neighbors, or even your friends. So we go through life knowing that race is an issue and racism is impacting our lives, but then on all around us, people have got different reasons why they're not talking about it. And being aware of that will help us become better. We can help navigate our own emotions and those of others. We can become aware of the risks that are there for us and for other people to talk about race. We can become more aware to the nuanced organizational dynamics at play, and then eventually become better at being able to express ourselves. Once we can navigate our emotions and other people's emotions, and we're aware of the risks involved for us and others, we become more clear and confident and precise in how we discuss race. And that's really what we need. So that, by way of introduction, just that emotional management skills is a big part of how we can become better advocates and communicators for social change in this specific space and other spaces. Now, why do we need to discuss race? Can't we just like get on with it and be one happy family and sing songs by the campfire? Well, no, because as much as we'd like to be a cohesive, united, multicultural society, as much as we love celebrating multiculturalism, race actually plays a very big role in how we experience life. And if anyone here is unsure if race has an impact on our lives, then maybe it doesn't have an impact on your life as significantly as it does on someone else's. But the dynamics of race and how it functions impact many of our social interactions. I'm going to show you a list here of some of the things that racism is connected to. And for some of you, this will be obvious. And for some of you, it'll be completely new. Some of you will know of the IPCC report that came out recently that mentioned the connection between colonialism and climate change. Some of you, that might be news for you. So I recommend perhaps looking into that. But racism is impacting all of these areas, from economic injustice to environmental loss. Why do I mean by environmental loss? Well, 80% of the world's biodiversity is under the custodianship of a very small percentage of the planet, which is First Nations people. So the persistence of one worldview over another is going to have an impact on how that biodiversity is protected. It has impacts on educational outcomes. It has impacts within companies and organizations trying to attract and retain talent. It impacts our physical and mental health. There are so many things that racism leads to and creates. And oftentimes we don't realize it if we haven't spent time sitting down thinking about it for a while. We're going to unpack some of these in the future sessions this week, next week, the following week, and the week after. We'll talk more deeply about the role of racism and climate change and how they're interconnected and what worldviews have got to do with racism and climate change. We'll talk about economic justice. We'll talk about organizational impacts. So those of you who have got different interest areas, whether it's local government, whether it's corporate D&I head, you'll all get your specific areas covered in the coming weeks. Brief overview on the census results recently. So much talk about the census recently. As you all know, our world is not homogenous, but for a long time, we thought our nation was. The White Australia policy was in place in this country until the 1970s, until it was officially disbanded in 1972. So for a long time, we thought this country was homogenous. But our census results more and more are showing us how diverse we actually are. 48.2% of us are first and second generation migrants. 3.3% identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And if you add to that third and fourth and fifth generation migrants who are from non-white backgrounds, you realize we're very close to being 50% non-white Australians. So our world is not homogenous, and neither is our nation. What does this mean? What's the significance of the fact that almost 50 or over 50% of us are from non-Western European backgrounds? Well, what it means is that a lack of diversity in our workplace is more obvious and inexcusable these days. A homogenous leadership group highlights power differentials. If our entire leadership group or our entire senior management is all of a specific background, then that means the diversity in our society is not being reflected in the diversity of our organization. And there's a disparity there. That's racism playing out in a very nice, polite, professional way. It could be lack of diversity in film and media. This is no longer acceptable to have an overwhelmingly white Australian media, TV personalities, film actors, radio hosts, if that's not the construct of our country. So what the census tells us is that despite the impacts of the White Australia policy, we are in fact a diverse nation. And if that diversity is not being represented in influential positions and positions of power and decision making, then there is an imbalance that needs to be addressed. And that's how race is having an impact on our society, because there's got to be a reason why that's happening. So efforts required. We need to put some work in to ensure that we are able to create the equitable society that we'd like to actually be living in. I want you to get you to think about one other thing for me tonight, or many things, but one thing I'd like to think about now is if you were to try and boil down the issue of race and racism, and you were to keep boiling it and boiling it and boiling it to see what is the essence of racism, what do you think it would be? Again, I'm going to open up the chat so I can see what you're saying in the chat function. I've missed a few messages. All right, the concept of the hour: fear, power, already two powers, ignorance, control. Very good. Keep typing. I'm watching these. Now, to resolve racism in society, whether it's in education, whether it's in the corporate space, whether it's in government policy, local government, we need to actually be able to recognize it. I'm still seeing these comments, so please keep going. Fear, capitalism, lack of education. So we need to recognize what racism actually looks like. And that's one of the key things I'd like to give you tonight, so that I can entice you to come back again next session and the one after. If I can at least help you to recognize what racism looks like a little bit clearer, then we can become more effective agents of change to address it and design policy to overcome it. The author Ibram X. Kendi says the heartbeat of racism is denial, right? And what he means by this is that it's denial that is the beating heart of racism, and it keeps it alive. The continued denial that racism exists is what allows racism to continue, right? And that's the heartbeat of it. But what I asked you to think about was the essence of it. And you've shared some very good ideas here. Limitations, closed doors, loss of existence, power, a few of you mentioned. Ignorance, lack of education. For me, my specific word, when I thought about it for long enough and continued going and going and going down to what it was at the core of it, it was a word that sat in the middle of these three here. When we're talking about gender inequality, economic inequality, and racial inequality, the word that I thought about as the essence was the one that many of you said in the chat function as well: power. If you're to boil it down, it really does come down to power differentials, power imbalance, a sense of superiority or enforced superiority. So if you wanted the short answer to how to end racism, the short answer is this one: address power dynamics. Understand that race was always about power, and it still functions in the same way. For some of us, that's news. For some of us, that's already quite clear. And I'm going to come back to this idea of power a number of times throughout this seminar series, and again later tonight as well. So first learning, or second or third or 10th learning, I'm not sure what we're up to. Racism is not just about prejudice. Racial inequality is not just about racial vilification. It is a sense of cultural superiority. It is about power. And that, again, might make perfect sense to some of you in this room, to many of you in this room, and to some of you, it might not make sense just yet. And that's totally fine. But we've got to get a more nuanced, clearer perspective of what race really is and how it functions in society before we can then design policy to overcome it, to undo its impacts, to create an equitable society. So these are some of the areas that I'd like to be able to run you through, not tonight because we don't have that much time, but over the course of the coming weeks, we're going to talk about these things. We're going to talk more about economics as well as ethnicity. We're going to talk about inclusion as well as superiority. And these are the areas that we've got to improve our vocabulary on and our understanding of if we want to become more competent and confident speakers of race. Because it's oftentimes easy to derail us. We get knocked off of our center of gravity because of one statement or one comment that we're not quite sure how to answer. And a few of you here tonight, I know, are past students of mine, and you've mentioned how you've been able to affect and impact change within your organization simply by being able to talk more clearly about race with your colleagues and your management. And that center of gravity is what I'm hoping to be able to give you all tonight, and then continue getting more nuanced and specific as we go in the weeks ahead of us. Now, when we think of race, I want to show you a few images, and some of these are traumatic. So I'm going to give you a trigger warning. You don't have to look at it. And I'm not going to hold these images up for very long. But when we think about racism, oftentimes we think about images like this: slavery and colonization. Or we think about white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan. Or we think about prejudice on public transport and sporting fields and in public spaces. These are often the images that come to our minds when we think about racism. But unfortunately, it's not just that. It's actually a lot more nuanced than that. It's a lot more pervasive than just those issues. Sometimes racism can look like this: imbalanced workplace recruitment processes, whereby an entire workforce looks basically the same, sounds the same, even their surnames are the same. That's how racism can play out sometimes. Sometimes racism looks like this. It looks quite nice, doesn't it? There's a few people from quote unquote diverse backgrounds in there. You know, there's a bit of color sprinkled in there, but where is it? It's in the back and on the fringes, on the sides. It's not really front and center. So a nation that loves to celebrate its cultural diversity still lacks that cultural diversity in certain spaces. And a lot of times it's in our workplaces and in decision-making processes. Sometimes racism can look like this. I didn't have to Google racism to find this image. Some of you will be nodding your heads profusely while looking at this. If this is an ad for a corporate event entertainer, right? It's just some random image I found off the internet. But if our corporate events are looking like this, then there's some inequity or imbalance going on there. There's a lack of representation that is becoming much more obvious as the years go on. And sometimes racism can look like this. I've written a whole essay on just this image alone, and I will share and unpack this image with you in a later session. Immediately looking at this image, some of you will have a very strong reaction to it, and you'll be fully aware of what I'm talking about without even me having said a word about it. Some of you might have an uneasy feeling and know there's something not quite right, but you're not quite sure how to explain it. And others will be looking at this image thinking, you can't see exactly what is so terrible about this image. And that's a perfect example of how we are all at different spaces along this journey of understanding what racism looks like in society. It's not really there's anything racist particularly about the flag per se, even though there is colonization and all that, etc. But it's the curation of this image that I'm talking about. It's the person behind the lens. It's the editor who decided to use this photograph. It's the adults who coerced children to put this flag on themselves, because the image, as we all know, speaks 1,000 words. So this is what I'm talking about when I mean the nuanced and subtle ways within which a sense of cultural superiority can be enforced within society. And being able to highlight these and talk about these will help us become more competent educators and speakers of race. I'd like to share a story with you, if I may, tonight. And I know my father is here tonight, and normally he is not present when I share this story. And I'm going to give you the abridged version because we are short of time tonight, and I don't want to keep you here all night long. But a quick story to help you understand. This man you see in front of you right now and that giant 4-meter laughing kookaburra, this man happens to be my father, Farvardin Deliri, Dr. Farvardin Deliri, OAM. He's a highly accomplished man who has been awarded the Order of Australia Medal for his services to community, published books, finished his PhD in education in his 5th language, survived imprisonment and torture as a Baha'i for his egalitarian beliefs, moved to Australia and raised 3 children with my mother, Lida, and worked in the space of community development for over 3 decades. I have a specific memory of him that I'm not going to share with you in detail, but just to give you a sense of what systemic racism feels like. In preparation for a job interview one day, for a job that he really wanted so that he could keep all the family together in Brisbane, my father, I'm going to stop this screen share, decided to scrub his face with some cleaning products from the laundry that I'm not going to tell you exactly what they were, diluted them down into a scourer that was not designed for faces, but rather for scrubbing pots. And being fully aware of the impact that the color of his skin would have on the interview process, he began scrubbing his face with this diluted floor cleaning product. And scrubbing so hard, in fact, that he caused blood to come from his skin and scabs to very quickly form. This is a man who, as I mentioned, was highly accomplished, is and was at the time still fully aware that the color of his skin would have an impact on the interview that he was about to go to. And it required nobody to say anything particularly racist to him. This is how race still functions in our society. And the color of our skin and our awareness of it has an impact on how we move through our life and how we are received by society, and how that influences where we end up, how much harder we need to work to get to certain spaces, and how much easier it is for us to fall down in that game of snakes and ladders that we're playing. That story is an abridged version, for the sake of brevity tonight, to highlight what we mean by the inescapability of racism and the inescapability of the dynamics of race in our society. Some of you may need to take a deep breath right now after hearing that. Some of you might be in shock. Some of you might have memories that are similar to this. Now, to reinforce the fact that this wasn't the case of a single, insecure, middle-aged Middle Eastern man, the skin bleaching product industry is a $3 billion industry in the country of India alone. That doesn't include the United States, Australia, the UK, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, and everywhere else in the world where skin bleaching products are used to lighten the color of people's skin, because they are aware of the impact it has on our lives. Now that, in juxtaposition with this, the slide you're now looking at, this idea that race is not actually real. It's a social construct. Just like we talk about gender being a social construct, race is also a social construct. It was created as an idea, and now it impacts every element of our lives. It was created a very long time ago, and we're going to talk about when and how and by whom. Race was created as an idea 500 years ago. And now we're dealing with the impact of it. Therefore, racism didn't actually always exist, because the mere word of race didn't even exist up until the 1600s. And understanding this idea that race is a social construct and that it was created is one of the key learnings that we need to have with us. To understand how this construct, just like the gender construct, plays out on us and impacts our lives, we also need to understand that race is a social construct. It is not scientifically backed or biologically true, but it impacts our lives. Now we're really getting into the thicker things tonight. In our brief introduction, hour and a half that we have, we're about halfway through as well. Racism is not just prejudice, as many of us have been led to believe. Racism is much more than just the racial vilification that we like to highlight sometimes, the random person telling us, go back to where you came from, or me when I'm at an ATM, with someone behind me saying, plenty of boat people out tonight. That is not nice, and it is racism, but it's also just one type of racism. If you really want to look at the definitions of them, that one is actually prejudice. It's a preconceived idea of someone that we don't like. Racism is an idea that human beings belong to different racial categories, and that each race sits within a hierarchy, and that each group of people is better at certain things. They have distinct and inherent capacities and capabilities as a racial group. That's racism at the core of it. In short, prejudice is a feeling. It exists in our hearts. Racism is an ideology, and it exists in systems and structures and policies and procedures. And as an idea, racism is much more powerful than the feeling of prejudice, because feelings can't hurt us. It's when you combine feelings with power that we get hurt. So understanding that racism is more than just a feeling of not liking somebody, then we can understand the different forms that it takes. It can take the interpersonal form, it can take the institutional or systemic form, and it can take the internalized form. And we'll talk more about each of these in the coming weeks. What is interpersonal racism, and how do we combat it? How do we talk about it? How do we make sure that our workplaces are places where it doesn't occur? How do we make sure that our schools are places where racism interpersonally doesn't occur? but then also thinking about it in a systemic way, in an institutional way. What is systemic racism? What is it when it means it's embedded within our structures of our society? We'll unpack each of these in further detail in the coming sessions. Now that we've separated the idea of race and prejudice, now we can talk about discrimination. Now we can consider what causes discrimination. And as much as we think racism acts alone, the racism and prejudice both require power to be able to create discrimination. And understanding that will allow us to be able to talk more clearly about race when we see it pop its head up in our conversations, in our policies, in our workplaces, and in public. A person with a lot of prejudice but no power in society or no influence in society can't create discrimination. And yet, on the flip side, a person with only a small or moderate amount of prejudice or even unconscious bias can create significant discrimination if they've got a lot of power or influence in an organization or in a society. And that's how discrimination comes about. It's through the exercise of power where prejudicial ideas exist. So it's part prejudice, part power. And we've got to be able to understand and separate these two if we want to talk about it in more clear, eloquent, articulate ways. And power comes in many forms. Power comes in all shapes and sizes, and it's not just about political leaders. It's about journalists and TV personalities, school teachers and school principals, art curators, landlords, coaching staff, check-in staff, heads of D&I, radio hosts. We all have some form of influence in society. We all have some way of being able to create impact. And when influence is concentrated, it becomes power. So it's not just about the all-powerful. Right? It's also about power differentials and power dynamics and who's got more than someone else in any given context. And if I was to ask you, each one of you who have been in any workplace environment, to consider one situation where you have more power than the other person. Let's say you're working or talking with a client, someone who's walked in off the street, you're helping them, or perhaps you're a teacher and a student, or perhaps you're talking to an intern who's just come to your workplace. Yeah, there's a power dynamic there. That's a situation where you have more power than the other person. But then if you leave that room and go into another room and you're not talking with a client or a student, but you're talking with your manager or the principal of the school, then all of a sudden the power dynamics are shifted. Now you're the one with slightly less influence in that particular room. That's what we mean by power and power dynamics. Being aware that in different contexts, we have different power and different influence. And if we can be aware of that, then we become more nuanced and aware of how race plays out in the workplace. And then we can talk about this thing. Then we can talk about unconscious bias as opposed to prejudice and how they are the same, but different. And tonight is not going to be about unconscious bias. So I'm going to breeze through these slides, but we will spend one particular night unpacking unconscious bias, a whole hour on unconscious bias and how it forms, how it's created, how we can undo it, how we can mitigate against it, all of these things. That's a whole 1 hour session on itself, which will come in week 3 or 4. But in short, unconscious bias is from the mind, whilst prejudice is from the heart. Prejudice is obvious and we can see it and feel it. Unconscious bias is more about how our brains work and less about how we feel about other people. And that might be a challenging realization to come to terms with, because sometimes our unconscious bias runs counter to what we actually consciously believe in our hearts. This is one of the most challenging things to come to terms with about unconscious bias, is that we have a consciously held belief that all human beings are one race, one family, etc., and that no one should be treated any better or worse than anybody else. But that our unconscious bias impacts our decision-making in ways that we're not even aware of. And knowing how it forms is one of the greatest ways of being able to mitigate how it impacts our work. So spending a couple of hours talking about unconscious bias one night will do us all the world of good to understand how we get it and how we can mitigate its impact. I'll give you a couple of ideas on how we get it. The content that we consume, the books that we read, the TV advertisements that we see, the pamphlets that we read, the billboards, the films, the TV series, the political discourse, the newspaper front covers, the conversations that radio hosts have, they all form unconscious bias in our brains because we are very good at pattern recognition. And our unconscious mind takes in ideas and content, even though we don't believe it. And any stereotype that we see or any pattern that we see repeated forms another synapse connection in our brain. And I'm talking about these kinds of images. Abhorrent images that cause us visceral reactions. The content that we consume has such an impact on causing unconscious bias that the UK regulation body, the watchdog, has implemented policies for advertisers in the UK where they cannot portray the stereotype of men being bad at housework. Let's stop the screen share again and open up the chat. Why is it that was such an important move? Why is it important to ban certain types of ads that show men as being good at housework and women as not being as good at, and women being better at housework? What's the whole situation there? We're talking about stereotypes. We're talking about reinforcing, thank you. Talking about stereotypes being repeated in our content that we consume, and ideas forming, excusing the behavior, Sarah Soto, thank you, right? And shadowing, normalizing the bias, exactly. So we understand, the research is out, that unconscious bias forms and stereotypes are reinforced in society through the content that we consume. So if there are consistent racial profiling that happens in our media and the films we consume and the characters that we watch on television and the roles they play in different situations, that forms unconscious bias, which is why we have to have a serious conversation about that at a later stage, right? So going back to the slides, I've just unpacked prejudice as opposed to race, talked about power and discrimination. We've talked about unconscious bias. And now we need to talk about this idea of the construct of race. One of the sessions that is coming up for us in the weeks ahead will be unpacking this, how the idea of race was formed, who it was formed by. These are some of the names of the people who were influential in creating the idea of race from the 1600s, 1700s, some from way back in the 1500s. The idea of race is a relatively new concept in the grand scheme of things. And understanding when, how, and by whom the idea of race was created gives us a strong understanding of the construct of race. And then we can unpack its impacts in society. Because everyone wants to talk about this thing, right? We all want to talk about systemic racism and how to undo it and unpack it. But understanding how race was formed as a construct and why helps us understand how it plays out in our workplaces today, in our policies today, in our governance positions. But we need to first understand how and why it was created. And that's what the construct of race or the construction of race, that's what that's all referring to. So hopefully we're going to get some time in a few weeks' time to unpack that so we can then understand this systemic racism. Already, you've had maybe half a dozen or a dozen new terms outlined and explained that can help separate things from prejudice to racism to interpersonal to systemic racism. These are different ways in which it pops up in our lives. Now, this is getting into some nuanced content. We're getting towards the end of the time we have tonight, and I wish I had hours to speak with you. I could go on for hours. I've been preparing for this all day, and I could speak to the tomorrow morning's dawn. But we don't. I don't want to keep you much longer than when we were scheduled to be here. But I want to give you an outline of an overview of some of the things we're going to cover. We've already touched on a whole bunch of things in the last hour we've been together. But in the coming weeks, we're going to dive deeper into some of the ways in which we can create strategies, policies, actions, and initiatives to create balance in society. Right now, our society is imbalanced. As a person who benefits from racism and suffers from racism's impacts, I am fully aware of how it plays out in society, and we all need to be as well. My family moved here as refugees. We migrated to this continent, right? And we got a fresh start because we were escaping religious persecution. But while I've benefited from moving here, I'm benefiting from someone else's dispossession. I'm benefiting while someone else is suffering because of my migration and others' migration. Being aware of these types of things allows us to have more complex conversations about race. And understanding it's not as simple as black and white. Right? There's a whole spectrum of ways in which race impacts us, benefits us, oppresses us. And we all have intersections. That's another theme we're going to unpack in the following weeks. Intersectionality of race and gender, of race and economics and gender. There's so many ways in which there are layers to this experience. I want to give you a very brief rundown. I've only recently created this series of slides, and it's more of like a progression of slides that goes from really subtle to really extreme. And we're going to start at the extreme end, because most of us, when we think of racism playing out, we're like, no, there's no racism in our organization. There's no racism in our school. There's no racism in our senior leadership. There's no racism in society, except for when this thing happened, that particular time. But race isn't about those moments where someone tells you to go back to where you came from, or when Adam Goods gets called an animal or booed for an entire season. It's not just those instances. So I want to show you this progression of slides to help you kind of become a bit more aware to the subtleties of it and the spectrum of impacts that it can have. Because once we're aware of this and we realize how this thing over here is connected to that thing over there, and they're all part of a broader spectrum, then we become more confident calling it out and then planning to create change in society. So let's start with this. The wheel of misfortune, and it's not meant to be a joke. It's actually a lot of misfortune. And it starts off from the left-hand side of outright prejudice and racial hatred. And it's quite serious because we're talking here about the impacts of death in custody. We're talking about race hate. We're talking about public lynchings that used to happen until not that long ago and still happen to this day. We're talking about child removals and incarceration differences, right? The fact that in the NT, such a small percentage of the population, the First Nations, Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, make up almost 99% of youth incarcerated. Child removals in this country are still 10 times the rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as opposed to non-Indigenous Australians. And that's what we think of sometimes when we think about race. And then if we go a little bit further, we think, maybe sometimes it includes, hate speech or racial profiling, or someone telling you F off, we're full, or we speak English here. We think about those kinds of really abhorrent and offensive kind of behaviors. And we're like, none of that's happened in our workplace. There's no racism here. There's no racism in society. And Australia is a relatively not racist place, if that's what we think racism is. And then you go to like racist jokes, bit of rudeness or mistreatment or some prejudicial treatment in the workplace, whether it's in the school or in the workplace. And we're like, that's still racism. Yeah, I get you. Yeah, okay. So that might happen sometimes. Maybe someone says a joke that they weren't meant to say. They don't lose their job over it. They just get to make an apology. We keep going. Then it looks like things like this. We have our own people to look after, or as long as they uphold Australian values when they come here, or let's keep the statues. I wish I could create a poll in the short few minutes we've got here to just talk about this one a little bit. But we're going to unpack this whole section here in a later session. We're going to talk about what's racist about keep the statues in the conversation when someone says, hey, that person actually killed my ancestors. When someone says, well, it's part of our history, we don't want to remove it. That is moving away from the outright racial violence to becoming more subtle form of racism. Because one person's history of colonizing a nation is more important to them than the offense and the grief it causes somebody else. And that's how racism can be embedded within some of these languages. Things like upholding Australian values. That in itself is a coded way of talking about supremacy. It's talking about, you can come here from there and there and there and there. We'll take you all in. Don't worry about what's happening with the First Nations people of this country, right? But as long as you uphold our values as Australian values, then you're welcome here. That is a subtle sense of cultural superiority, or a very overt sense, depending on how nuanced your thinking is, right? And we're just over halfway through. Then it gets to things like bias in recruitment or misrepresentation in film and media, right? When certain characters are constantly played by certain people from certain colored backgrounds. When you constantly see that portrayed, or even just the mere absence of people from leadership roles, whether it's in media leadership or whether it's in government or whether it's in corporate leadership, the mere absence of diversity when we know how diverse and multicultural our nation is, that in itself is an outcome of racism. This is how it's becoming more subtle. So simply the absence of diversity in one space, even though the nation is diverse and multicultural, highlights a power differential. And this is us bringing it back to the concept of power. And it gets more subtle than this, right? We go from absence in leadership positions in film and media to things like, you don't have to wear a hijab here, which is something a school teacher told a friend of mine's daughter here in Tasmania. A school teacher thinking she's doing the right thing, says, you know what, sweetheart, you're not in Afghanistan anymore. You don't have to wear the hijab. Here in Australia, you can take that off, sweetie. This is not Afghanistan. This type of stuff is what teachers get away with every day. They don't realize sometimes, perhaps, how racist or inappropriate that might seem. In one of the coming sessions, I'd like to unpack our response as a nation, as a media, as a government to the invasion of Ukraine. And those of you who saw the text just there on that slide that says, this is more horrific for me, you might be aware of what I'm talking about. There are videos of various journalists from all over the world who, in the heat of the moment, who on live to air television while covering the invasion of the Ukraine, without realizing what they were saying, said things like, this is more horrific to me because this is blonde-haired and blue-eyed people escaping war. Someone else said, these are not Syrians, these are Europeans. Thank you, Samara. Another person said, this isn't some war-torn nation in the Middle East or Africa. This is Europe we're talking about. There are compilations of different journalists, none of whom lost their job, mind you, but all of them expressed in one way or another how this was more severe for them than, say, watching Iraqis getting bombed or conflict in Africa or some other country that we've potentially invaded. So even that there shows how sometimes a person can hold a bias and then outright blurt it out in the heat of a moment. And that bias is always there. It's not like it's just in that single moment. It's always there. And it's impacting how they cover certain stories, how they overlook certain facts, and how they frame their journalism. And if you hadn't heard about that, it's as easy to find as it is to Google. Just go racism in Ukraine coverage, and you'll come up with a whole bunch of articles written about it, compilations of videos. And this is what we're talking about, how it becomes more subtle sometimes, because it exists, but it's not there. It's just somebody saying, this is more horrific for me. That doesn't seem like something outright racist, does it? It didn't say, F off to where you came from. It's a bit different, but it's still saying that one person's life is more valuable to them than somebody else's. And then we get to the really subtle spaces of supremacy and superiority. And each of these areas we're going to unpack in the coming session. So tonight, I'm hoping I've been able to entice you or inspire you to come back, to maybe bring a friend with you, and we're going to unpack some of these things. We're going to talk about savior mentality. We're going to talk about saying phrases like my African friend, as opposed to, my Sudanese friend or my Somali friend or my Ugandan friend or my Congolese friend. If you just randomly blurt out things like my African friend, that there shows a lack of an awareness. It says that you just grouped the whole continent of nations into one, whereas you wouldn't normally say something like my European friend. You'd say something like my Swedish friend, my Norwegian friend, my French, Portuguese, Spanish friend. But then when it comes to people from one continent, we just say my African friend. These are more subtle ways in which you can pop up in our conversations as well. I'd like to share with you, in the time we have, a story of myself now. I shared one about my father earlier tonight, but not that long ago, only a couple of years ago, in the middle of a meeting where I was consulting as an expert in my space, communication for social change. We're talking about anti-racism. We're talking about how a broader anti-racism strategy and talking about racial equality would be a good thing for this organization, as opposed, with regard to their outwardly focused communications. And mid-sentence, I was interrupted, and a senior executive from this organization said to me, you know what, Irfan, what I'd really like to do is to create or work towards a country, building a country where one day someone like you can have a job like mine. At the time, I've got a master's in communication for social change. I've published 3 books. I'm there as an expert in my field, talking to this person who has no more, if not less, qualifications than myself. And I'm being told that he'd like to work towards a country that one day someone like me can have a job like his. This is how subtle it can be sometimes. Now, I say subtle because in that moment it's very obvious and overt to me. But that type of thinking exists in everyday decision-making processes, and it's always there. And it frames how we design projects, how we design policies, how we design curriculum. And being able to unpack that is going to help us go a long way towards creating the equality and the equity that we actually want to see in society. I know that tonight we've covered a whole bunch of really heavy topics, and I know it hasn't necessarily been easy. I wish I had a couple of hours more tonight to go through it a bit slower. I'm looking forward to putting you into breakout groups to have one-on-one or two-on-two conversations eventually at some point. But I wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the themes we're going to cover in the coming weeks. And I know you've all got very busy lives and you can't be there at every single session, but the recordings will be made available to you. And you can miss a session and catch up on it and come to a next one, or you can miss a couple and invite other friends to. What I'd like to invite you to do is that if you've learned anything tonight, if you found any part of the hour and 15 minutes that we have together tonight useful, to maybe take a screenshot or maybe write a post about it or just share it in an email to other people. Because in 4 or 5 weeks' time, one of 2 things is going to happen. We can either come down from the 250 people who registered right down to a hardcore group of 40 or 50 people who really want to get into it, or we can grow this. We can go from 100 participants to 150 to 300. We can continue bringing additional people into this conversation. And by you sharing how important this conversation is to you, how potentially one way or another way that I've been able to help you tonight, we can bring a few more people to this conversation. Because if we want to be able to live in a society that actually is cohesive and just and connected, and we want to celebrate multiculturalism as we rightly should, then we've also got to work towards removing those barriers to full and proper inclusion. And some of those barriers are in the ways in which we talk about and address race or avoid race. So getting to racial equity is not going to happen in an hour and 15 minutes, as you know. It's going to take years of work from all of us. But I'm hoping in the coming conversations, I can help build some confidence and some competence in all of you so that you can become more effective when wanting to talk about these issues. I want to show you a couple of extra slides before we go. This is one that I showed you earlier, understanding race as cultural superiority. And I want you to think about this as homework. This is something we're going to unpack in one of the other later sessions if you come back and join us. Both of these sports professionals from the same code experienced one sexism and one racism, both from on and off the field. But the response to those situations is something I'd like you to think about. And if you've watched the documentaries on both of these players, then you might already be aware of what I'm hinting at. And if you want to unpack that, then come back next week and we're going to unpack the disparity in how the media reacted to each of these individuals and the sexism or racism that they experienced. Taylor Harris and Adam Goods both experienced something they shouldn't have experienced. But our media responded in a very different way, much like the media that covered the Ukraine invasion. There's a disparity. One was immediate and responsive, jumping, as they rightly should have, and said, this is absolutely abhorrent. And everybody, file and rank, was there to support Taylor Harris, as they should have, because the sexism she faced online was abhorrent. It was disgusting, and it should never have happened. On the other hand, we had a champion of the sport, Adam Goods, at a later stage in his career, an absolute champion, but forced to retire far too soon because the media didn't give him the support that he deserved as an Aboriginal man playing this sport. And they argued over what he did was right or wrong, and whether the invisible spear that he threw was offensive or violent. And there wasn't that sort of support there. And that debate on the footy show or in the newspapers, on the ABC, on the radios, that prolonged conversation about what he did that was right and wrong, et cetera, is what allowed the audiences and the spectators to boo him for an entire season into retirement. And understanding how sometimes different groups of people get responded to in different ways helps us understand how it plays out in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities. We've gone over by 3 minutes already. I'll probably go over by another few more minutes. If you need to rush away and leave, you can watch the final 5 or 10 minutes on the recording. If you can stay for another 5 or so minutes, please do so. We've just shared with you the link to a very quick, short survey. If you can answer those 7 or 8 questions very quickly, a couple of multiple choices, it'll help us understand who you are, where you're coming from, and what you'd like to get out of this series. I know today there are people from local government, there are D&I experts and professionals looking to further their awarenesses. There are people who work in the corporate space, those who work in the not-for-profit space, those who are academics, those who are students. So we're speaking to a very broad range of people. And I'd like to know a bit about you. So that survey, that little type form link there would really help us know who we're speaking with and how we can best suit your needs. I do this every day of the week, as you know, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know you. Tonight has been a webinar format where I've spoken the whole time and you haven't really been able to speak as much. But as we go on, we're going to try different things. We're going to try breakout groups. We're going to try hearing from you a bit more. I'm going to try some polls as well to get the feedback of the audience. I'm just dropping in there some details. If anyone would like to reach out to us, my email's there, my website's there. You can talk to us directly, or you could find out about us on our website as well. And I want to thank you, each and every one of you, the 95, 100 of you, there was 111 at one stage who are here tonight, who took time out of your evening after work to be here to talk about race and racial equity. It means the absolute world to me, because it tells me that there are others out there who are passionate about resolving this issue and who are passionate about becoming better equipped and adequate to solve these issues that we face in society. And I want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who took the time to register, some of you re-register, to be here tonight in the midst of everything else that you've going on in your lives, to learn a few things and to hear me speak about racial equity tonight. So please give yourselves a pat on the back. Thank you for being here. I'm hoping that I'll see you all back here next week. Tonight was a very brief introduction to a huge conversation that I'm hoping to unpack in the coming weeks. And even if you can't make all 12, make it to 3, make it to 4, however many you can, I assure you, we're going to go through some really interesting conversations in the coming weeks. I'm seeing your thanks coming through now. You can tell I'm wrapping it up. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here with me. And if there's anything that you'd like to hear about, that survey that we just dropped in there is the best way to tell us. If there's specific areas or topics you'd like to talk about, whether it's, fragility or privilege, whether it's strategy or curriculum, whether it's how to create more cohesive local government areas, or whether it's, a corporate policy, let us know. Tell us, give us the ideas, because we do this every day of the week with people from all sorts of areas. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you'd like for us to specifically cover. Thank you, everyone. I'm reading the messages. I will save this. The slides will be made available to you eventually. We're going to upload the slides. And for everyone who registered in the last 48 hours, we've got your emails. If you haven't registered in the last 48 hours, Zoom lost all of your emails. So please fill out the quick survey and then we'll have your emails. Once we've got that, we can send you an email to give you access to the recording and the slides and tell you when the next session's on as well. So thank you so much. Lots of love to you all. I'm going to stay on for a couple of minutes for those who are typing messages because I want to read these messages, but I'm noticing some of you are dropping off right now. If you've got specific questions, I can stay on and answer a few questions. I'm going to stop the recording now and I'll upload this video very shortly. And I hope to see you all very shortly next week. Before we leave, I'd like to acknowledge that tonight, before we started, I was praying and hoping for the presence of Tonki Logan, Uncle Philip Obar, and my own uncle Farazan Daliri, who passed away last week, and who I never got to meet in person. He was also a refugee escaping religious persecution from Iran, and as my family came to Australia, my uncle went to Brazil, and because of the chances and circumstances of the world, we never actually got to meet in person in the 40 odd years I've been alive. And I was calling upon their spirits, Tonki Logan, Uncle Philip Obar, and my Uncle Farazam to be with us tonight. And I'd like you to keep them all in your thoughts going forward, and to help me work with you to create a more equitable society, so no one has to flee their home or to experience inequity or injustice in their own country. Lots of love to you all. I'll pause the recording now, and I look forward to seeing you and at least one friend with you next week at the same time. Much love to you all. Good night for now.